We on?
Yeah.
Good. Hi there, it's Ed here, coming to you on Friday with our normal midday stream. And we are going to be talking about all things workplace relations as usual and how they relate to COVID-19. Some new things in my ear today, which hopefully mean the sound is better. Um, Funnily enough, I saw an advert in the newspaper today for microphones and things like that, which is obviously we're obviously not alone in businesses doing forms of live stream and podcasts. So much so that people are taking out full page spread about buying microphone equipment. So we should get on to that shortly. I'm going to follow the usual structure today, trying to maintain that 3C's mantra of being clear, consistent, and concise. Clear, consistent, and concise in my communication to you. In doing so, I'm going to go through a pivot story. I've got a really good one today. I'm then going to talk to you a bit about redundancy processes. I think that in the vein of planning, it's useful for me to talk to you about what redundancy might look like and how you go through the process of assessing that and what a process looks like. 'Cause it does take time. It's not easy. And it's also consistent with me saying to you guys that you shouldn't be sticking your head in the JobKeeper sand. You should be starting to think about this because the timing and how it works will be quite important in your planning process. And then I also grateful to the pivot story of sorts I used yesterday, and the client that had reached out explaining that they had just got up and running again when she, as the business owner, was confirmed with COVID-19. And what she's done for me is set out exactly what happens in that process. And it's both very interesting, but also a bit alarming as to the fact that it's slightly different to what the government says on its websites as to what our obligations are, and importantly, what the consequences would be for our businesses. So I'm going to read that out as well because I think it's really useful for us to understand. It's certainly, and thank you very much to that client, because it's certainly caused us here to reassess this morning in our 8:30 daily COVID committee meeting where we do our crisis management, to reconsider what our reintegration of the workforce into the office looks like because of the risk factors that flow from what in fact happens if someone's confirmed as having COVID-19 in your workplace. So after that, we'll do the usual Q&A. We've got also some really good questions that come in via email overnight, and we'll go through those. But I'm going to start with that pivot story as promised. And if you bear with me, I'm going to read out the email. This is going to seem a bit self-indulgent, but because the email relates to a story of some advice that this particular client took from us. And how that worked for them. And there's an element of not so much patting myself on the back, certainly wanting to pat the Employ Sure staff that were involved with this on the back. So when I read it last night, I'm not too macho to admit that I've got a bit of a lump in my throat because it really reaffirmed my purpose of why I set up Employ Sure 10 years ago. It was to do exactly this kind of help. And to see the group of staff that worked on this case working in such harmony to the assistance of this particular client was just great for me. You know, at a time where, you know, for all of the positiveness I try and give across on this, you know, we're all human, we're all business owners, and we have slumps in our motivation and energy through this crisis. And to receive this email last night really put fire in my belly. And as I say, it made me a touch emotional, so I'll try and get through it without being emotional now. But so this is what the email says. I am an optometrist. I'm keeping names, states, everything else private and confidential here because we don't know yet as to whether this might lead to some form of further proceeding. During March, as we were all trying to respond quickly to the fast-changing guidelines on social distancing that soon became enforceable directives, I was trying to implement strategies to keep the business functioning to protect both staff and clients. All of my staff members were exceptionally helpful, flexible, and generous in taking some leave, redeploying their skills, or working from home for the first time ever. except one. Now, just pausing there, it's quite interesting. I mean, that introduction could be the story of so many of our businesses back in March, particularly as to what was happening, but also very typical of what I see from business owners, that I bang on here about the fact that you've got a business owner's hat and then you have your hat as an employer. And yet again, what we have here is a business owner who the very first thing they're saying to me is how much they're doing things for the benefit of their staff rather than because of the business. Which is very typical, I find, of small business owners. Anyway, back to the story. With the help of your advice team, I attempted to manage this employee and gave her lots of encouragement and support in trying to find a positive and productive way for her to remain involved in the business. She was particularly upset about my directives to staff not to drop into work if they were not rostered on, and that I requested no personal parcels to come through the store. This was previously, I'd turned a blind eye to this, especially for full-timers. Personal parcels were delivered through the workplace because the employees are not at home, and we'll all see that, and I imagine a lot of us take that approach as well. In any case, I became suspicious of why this employee was so hell-bent on coming into the store on her day off, why she hated working from home on the tasks I gave her, and why she was so offended by my change in policy regarding personal mail. It is my business after all. So with this in mind and a touch of the COVID-19 cleaning bug, I decided to clear out some of the drawers and files in the store where this disgruntled manager usually works. And what I uncovered was a minefield of employee theft. Needless to say, by this manager. I found hidden paperwork that led me to discover that glasses had been provided to family and friends largely at my expense for the last 5 years, with a mammoth effort to cover her paper trail by destroying documents and deleting company records. I estimate the cost to my business at being over $30,000. This person has been my friend for years and was a trusted and well-liked member of my staff. Your advice team guided me through the entire process, and the employee was subsequently dismissed. The process, from my finding the first piece of evidence to dismissal, took approximately a week. I've just had one of your team conduct the disciplinary meeting, and the matter has now been handed over to the police. I wanted to relay this story to you, Ed, for a couple of reasons. The first being thank you. Your company is amazing. Thank you. That's just the bit where I began to get a bit throaty last night, I think. Your staff members are exceptional, and I'm so grateful for their expertise and guidance. Whenever I speak to any of your staff members, I'm treated with respect and kindness. I'm never made to feel like I've asked a stupid question, even when I probably have. Secondly, I wanted to give you the feedback that I appreciate how your advice team helps you to help yourself. They don't just tell you what to do, but they give you options under the guidelines of the legislation and empower you to make your own decisions based on sound information and advice. I've learned so much about how to run my business and manage my staff since signing up nearly 5 years ago, and I'll definitely be renewing my contract. That's good news. HR is now an aspect of my business ownership that I really enjoy, and I have a half-baked idea to make a career change and come and work for you. Well, you're always welcome. Lastly, I believe that mine is a pivot story of sorts. I've not turned my espresso martini into hand sanitizer. It sounds like it's probably been drunk last night. However, the COVID-19 crisis has uncovered a theft and deception of a senior and trusted employee, which now frees my business from the financial strain of long-term and insidious skimming. My colleagues and I feel as though we've all been taken a bit of a kick in the guts. It's emotionally draining, as you can imagine, to be betrayed by someone so close in a small business, but we're committed to changing our procedures and implementing new policies to prevent this from happening again. And that can only be a positive thing. Wow, that's a really powerful email for me, certainly, but probably for all of us as small business owners. Just the thought, when we all set out on the journey of setting up small businesses, something I hear time and time again, and certainly can echo this experience, is you have all sorts of visions as to how things are going to go and where you're going to get to and so forth. What you never know until you do it is all of the challenges and the relentless, I suppose, challenges to your values in cases like that. You set up with a certain set of values which lead you to trust people, and people in that case do let you down. And being a small business owner sometimes is about working through that and not becoming too cynical. I heard it said on a podcast I listened to recently that running a small business was a really good metaphor. They said, imagine it as though you've got a bag of mojo, whatever mojo is, and your job as a small business owner is to protect people from cutting that bag open. So you're dancing around the bag, trying to prevent people from coming in and slashing that bag open. And if you get too many of those cuts, ultimately all of the mojo runs out of the bag and you're defeated. And that really resonated with me. I think there are moments in running small business where it does feel like that. In this particular case, is a fairly significant cut to your mojo, but the positivity that is being seen there is this being actually a pivot story rather than feeling entirely deflated in the context of COVID-19 for all of the business detriment that was already being suffered. To say, no, this is a pivot story. This is something that I'm going to take the positive out of and move forward. Was an inspiration to me, so I wanted to share that with you. Thank you very much for sending that in to that particular client. So I said that the next one I'm going to do is to talk about redundancy, just so that I'm not just reading things out for the whole session. But I want to talk to you about redundancy. I've had a couple of questions overnight from clients who and non-clients who are pleasingly taking their head out of the JobKeeper sand and saying, look, JobKeeper's great, but what about my planning going forward? What does a redundancy process look like? And one of the things that I notice when speaking to small businesses about this is that there is a bit of confusion about the way in which redundancy works. Quite often small businesses say, oh, I'm a small business, therefore I don't have to make redundancy payments. They confuse that with the concept that you don't have to go through a fair redundancy process. There's nothing that stops you from being sued for unfair dismissal, even if you don't have to pay for redundancy payments. So what we advocate here is a relatively cautious approach, but we think it's also a respectful approach to your employees as well. And the way in which is a broad process I would look at doing a redundancy is that first of all, you should be considering this not as at an individual role level, but you should be considering whether there are certain jobs in your business, functions in your business that might be reducing or might no longer be necessary. And if you look at it on that basis, you might have, and I'm going to use a hypothetical example of where, just because this is where it gets quite confusing for businesses. Let's say you have one type of job for which you no longer have any need, and you have reduced need, but you have two people doing the same job at the moment. You now only really need one. So potentially a redundancy situation arises there. How do you go through the process of making one of those people redundant? I stress that it's one of those people because quite often people will say, oh, I want to make that person redundant. And that's not the way redundancy, a fair redundancy works. You need to more objectively assess which person should be made redundant on a set of criteria. So what you do is that you would say to those two people who are the ones that are potentially affected by redundancy, by the redundancy, and I say potentially because you should not go into a redundancy process with a closed mind that will definitely be the outcome. You need to go in with an open mind, which is essentially saying to your staff at what you might call a warning meeting or a kick-off meeting to them to say to those people, those two people, unfortunately, this is the business circumstance that we find ourselves in. That has led to a reduction in the need for the type of work that you both do. We believe that we only need one person to do that role going forward, and we're entering into a redundancy consultation process with you. Now, that consultation process should be genuine. And you might arrange to have individual meetings with those employees, or you might just ask them to provide you with any questions or suggestions that they may have. They might ask for more information about the detail of why that work is reduced. Is there anything else you could do about it? They might at that point start to talk about the fact that the work might have reduced, but maybe we could share responsibilities or have some reduction in hours of work, or they might come up with ideas that are alternatives to redundancy, and that you should have a genuine dialogue about that. If they don't come up with any ideas, or you fairly listen to those ideas, but for reasons that you can justify, they're not going to solve the problem, you're going to need to select one of those people. And you do that typically by creating a selection process, setting out a set of criteria that most fundamentally don't end up unfairly or on a discriminatory basis selecting one person ahead of the other. So for example, classically, you wouldn't use criteria like I'm going to pick the youngest person or the oldest person. Less still would you use criteria like one of them's male, one's female, and I'm worried the female might be having children soon anyway, or something like that. Stuff that in your mind you might somewhere be able to justify it, but it will lead you down an awful legal pathway if you do select people on that sort of basis. You would be looking at, there's a very traditional one, which is last in, first out. That's a very basic one. I don't tend to like that personally. You run the risk of discriminating against younger staff on that basis as well, if they're more recently in the job. You might look at other things like the way the way in which those staff members have performed, if you can objectively make assessments on that. And you might set out a group of criteria that fairly determines which one of those staff members is going to be selected. Once you've done the criteria and you scored those staff members, you will provisionally I stress, you still haven't made a decision, select one of them, and you'd invite them into a further meeting. They'd be entitled to have a support person, and you'd talk to them about the fact that they have been provisionally selected. You have heard their consultation. You will need to have considered at that point whether there is any alternative employment for them in the business. And if there's not, you'd still be seeking any final feedback from them before you would move forward to a redundancy. Now, you can hear from, even on a hypothetical, very simple example, that there's a lot of hurdles in that. It takes time. Time equals cost. And you may well, at the end of all of that, have the additional cost of a redundancy payment as well. And the reason I'm expressing that, and I'm not trying to over-egg, that's really just how complex it is because of the time that it takes. What you don't want to be doing is doing that right at the end of the JobKeeper program, where you already know that the work is not there or is likely not to be there, and you end up with all the time and expense that is involved in going through that process when you are paying for it rather than JobKeeper. You'd be better off looking at how JobKeeper can help you now to make good decisions whilst minimizing the cost of the period with which that takes. So it's going to take you at least a week, I'd say, to go through that process. Anything less than that feels quite rushed. And then on top of that, you're going to have notice periods and maybe redundancy pay and so forth. So I thought I'd just give you a brief skim through a classic redundancy process. I'm not urging you all to go out there and start making people redundant. What I am urging you all to do, though, is to make rational business decisions based upon what you are seeing and what you are projecting, rather than burying your head in the JobKeeper sand. There's my piece on redundancy. I'm just going to go on then to the email that I received from a separate client about the fact that, as I said yesterday, she has the somewhat unwanted title of being the only person I know that's had COVID-19. And the bad news for her, but good news for me in that, is that she's been able to provide me with a very clear understanding as to exactly what happens when you have a positive test. And I think it's really important, this, because, as I say, it's quite different from what you'll get. And I've waded through every single website that might tell me what's going on in terms of government websites and health websites and so forth. to find out exactly what to do for my own business. I've been looking at this, trying to understand what my obligations are. Now, my understanding of the obligations are, if someone's presented at your workplace as being sick in any way, you should immediately send them home and ask them to get tested. Now, in that process, it can take days to get the tests back, but in that process, you would be starting to understand who they've had close contact with, and you might be monitoring the health of those people and asking those people to take care not to come in if they in any way feel sick. So that is what I'd understood as the base position, which I believe is correct, by the way. But what happens then, and from what I can ascertain online, if someone, if that person, the first person, was actually found to have COVID-19, you can still carry on operating your business as long as those people they've had close contact with don't start falling like flies as well. Now, that's quite different, in fact, to the practice of what occurs, and I just want to go through this with you. So the first stage is that once you've presented to your employer, in our client's case, she was the employer, you are sent home. You need to go home and immediately self-isolate. And what that means, you go home, you don't leave home, you're allowed out in your yard, etc., but you've got to be in, so there's no popping out for exercise or to the shops or anything else that we've got used to during shutdown. Before you go home, you'll probably go and get your test done. You'll get a text message if you get a negative result, but you get a call from the lab if you are positive. It can take up to 7 days before you get a result. If you're negative and you just decided to have the test because of a few symptoms, life carries on. If you're tested because you'd already been identified as being a close contact, then you need to remain in isolation until the Department of Health contacts you, and I'll just explain a bit more about that in a moment. If you're tested positive, the pathology lab calls and says you're positive, you need to go into immediate isolation. You're probably there already. You tell them where you are and they will tell you how to get home and what to do if you're not in isolation already. You then get a second call from a doctor, possibly a nurse, and they'll ask you when you first noticed symptoms, and the day on which you first noticed symptoms becomes known as day one. They'll go through all of your symptoms every day since that point. And bear in mind, if you haven't gone for the test immediately when you first had symptoms, because they could have been minor, it's actually not the day you get tested, it's the day that you have the first symptoms. You then need to remember exactly how you felt for something that looks like 28 days prior to that call, which is just extraordinary. You're going to have to work out and go back through your mind, probably your diaries, probably your phones, to try and understand what was going on. Do you recall feeling sick on any days and so forth? Third call you get from contact tracing. They ask you to tell them everyone and everywhere you have been for the 14 days before day one up to the current day. So again, you're potentially talking about a month's worth of your social interactions and everything else that even in the more limited world that we've been living in is quite an extraordinary thing to have to work out. So this particular client flagged how hard that was to do. Had to end up looking at bank receipts or bank statements and so forth to try and jog her memory as to what was going on and who she might have had close contact with. The close contacts are defined as people you've spent more than 15 minutes talking to or within the same building for 2 hours, apparently. That's what was told to this client, and that raises some really interesting questions to the business. You've been talking to for more than 15 minutes or in the building for 2 hours. So we're in an office building here with a number of floors. We're one of, I think, 4 businesses in here. We're in the same building as people that I have no contact with whatsoever, other than I might see them in the foyer or be in the lift with them. Might go to the same coffee shop. But on the basis here, if I spend a day in work and they spend a day in work, then we're in the same building and therefore have some form of close contact according to the rules that were expressed to this client. All identified close contacts are contacted. You're not told who the infected person is, so you could be surprised, you could be worried about who that might be, and you're told to self-isolate immediately for 2 weeks. So you could be in the middle of doing something and you're told literally to drop that and move and go and self-isolate. And you can opt to be tested. You don't have to get tested, but you can opt to. Even if you do get tested, if you're negative, you've still got to stay in self-isolation for 14 days. And if you're positive, you go through the same steps of self-isolation and so forth. So what's very concerning about this is a few things, is that isolation of that breadth of group of people is really quite significant. So classically, we had here earlier in the week, I mentioned it yesterday, one of our staff members felt ill at work and went home after that. Now, I had seen him in the coffee shop that morning. We'd had a chat from no closer than 3 meters, I'd say. He, as part of our internal protocols, flagged with our HR team that we'd seen each other quite properly for him to do that. But what worries me is that it turned out that he didn't have COVID-19, which is great, but had he had that, he would have been asked by the Department of Health who he'd had close contact with, and I probably would have featured on that list just out of prudence on his part. Now, there's a risk then that suddenly people that you haven't actually been within 1.5 meters of provide your name, you end up getting swallowed up in the close contact list and go into self-isolation for 14 days. Or just because we're in the same building for more than 2 hours, he sits on a different floor to me. I didn't see him at all during the day, but there's a risk, according to this process, that we end up getting told to self-isolate. That obviously has a ramification on the ability of your business to carry on running if someone in your business gets this, or someone else in your building potentially. And indeed, what subsequently happened to this client is that they were told that they had to shut their business, and they would get further advice as to when it could open again. And that's pretty amazing, really, because that is not what's said online at all, that you are told that you have to shut your business. So think about all of your different environments. Think about what would happen if that sequence of events happened to you, because those things certainly need to be in a plan. You need to be ready to go in case, for example, you have to shut your business, and your business, that some work can be done from home perhaps still. But if people are literally having to drop their things and go now, are they actually going to be set up to work from home when that happens, when they're self-isolating? That level of disruption could cause you a significant business impact that you are going to need to be careful on. The other kind of things that occur at the back end of it is that you get some fairly consistent contact from various bodies, but one of them is the police. They call in on you to check you're doing the right thing. Stories here of staff members seeing the police circling around their houses, which has worried them. Bear in mind that you might not know who on earth you're self-isolating because of, and the next thing you know, you're at home for 14 days. I know we've all been at home to a degree, but this is quite different. You're not allowed outside at all here other than into your backyard, and you've got the police doing laps of your place. That's quite a disconcerting set of circumstances for people. So there's a lot there to think about, but I thought it really useful to go through it because it's actually more, well, first of all, it's different to what's online. Second of all, that's really quite a significant impact to your business. We've talked this morning internally about our plan to get people back into the office. I've already spoken about how we have people here on an exception rule at the moment, so we don't have a huge number in here, but we've got people that have said that they can't reasonably work from home. We were starting to formulate a plan for a couple of weeks of bringing people in, perhaps on a rotation system, that sort of thing. But we need to factor in this, because if this occurred, we would go back to where we were back in March and potentially lose a large portion of our workforce who, unless we're well set up, wouldn't be able to work, which would have a negative impact on our ability to deliver to clients. So you'll need to do your own version of those calculations to understand if and how you start bringing your staff members back into the workplace, because being successful in this crisis, we talked before about how our mission at EmploySure is to achieve business success throughout COVID-19 and beyond. doesn't mean just doing this, it means actually coming out of this successfully as well, not just shutting down in the right way, but springing back in the right way. So those were the bits that I wanted to cover before we go on to the questions. Hopefully some use to you, and over to you, Stewie, for some questions.
Sure. This one from Roger, a quick one. I'm opening my cafe on Saturday. I've heard I have to get customers' names, addresses and numbers. Is this right? I certainly don't feel comfortable doing this.
No, I heard that. That's second or third hand somewhere. I'm not seeing anything formally on that, Roger, that because of contact tracing requirements, should anyone get sick, you need to know, because for exactly the reasons we've just been through. So someone says, who have you been in contact with? And you're saying in a cafe, I've been in contact with all of these different customers. That's not what's happening in cafes that I've been into, and I've heard of no change of rules as to that being likely to happen at this stage. If anyone has heard anything different, let me know.
Okay. Ed, we talked about this one from Matthew, who makes musical instruments. Can I read that one out?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. From Matthew, he is a musical instrument maker in Sydney. I have received...
Not the last bit though, if that's right, just there. I think there might be a bit of a private final 2 paragraphs on that. So the rest of it is fine.
Say again, sorry?
Just not the final paragraph or so, I think, just the rest.
Yes. Okay. Tell me to shut up.
Yep, I will.
Matthew says, I have received the first JobKeeper payment yesterday, which is a relief, but also gives me a headache in the event that business picks up to the extent that my expected downturn in the end is less than 30%. I anticipated a significant downturn from April. If JobKeeper had not been offered, I would have just stopped taking orders for April, let my long-term casual go onto JobSeeker, worked solo to pay the rent, and managed until business picked up again, at which point I would take my guys back onto payroll. None of us knew, of course, how long the off switch would be turned off, and April was very slow. However, with JobKeeper on offer, as I estimated a significant downturn greater than 30%, and only to do the right thing by my employees, I enrolled with JobKeeper. I paid them the required $1,500 each fortnight, 3 fortnights to date, in good faith. For them, it's a good arrangement and better than JobSeeker. I realise now it may turn out that my business picks up a bit from now on, to the extent that I may not, in fact, be eligible when things are in at the end of the June. Perhaps only a 20% downturn for the whole quarter. Hard to say. I'm bringing my 2 employees back on this from this week in a very COVID-safe way. So, what irks me about this is that if my business does pick up, even a little bit, I may have shot myself in the foot, as if the ATO asks for the JobKeeper money back, I'll be out of pocket for wages with no benefit to me. So what incentive is there for me to build up my business if I'm going to have to repay the subsidy as a result, because I may not be able to make up the difference? I know I can't claw back JobKeeper from my employees. So this is the question. Can I leave JobKeeper scheme early, retain the allowance for the first few weeks while business was down without penalty, and just pay my employees from now on their hours worked? Or must I stay on until the end of the scheme?
Just realised halfway through that, can people hear Stewie?
Yes, they're fine.
if
Yes,
I'm on these,
yes,
good.
yes.
I thought he did very good performance as well. I thought it'd be a real disappointment if no one could hear. So, no, exactly. It is a very good question, and very put into the words and emotions of a small business owner very well and dramatically by Stewie, I thought. So a really valid question. In a nutshell, what it is that I was trying to do the right thing by JobKeeper. I thought that I would have a 30% downturn, and it's not turned out that way, or I don't think it will turn out that way for the whole of the time till September. I don't want to be in a position where I've paid JobKeeper and I end up having to pay it back. That follows on from the advice that I've given here, which is if you're not getting if you haven't seen the 30% downturn, despite the fact that you projected that you might reasonably think that you would, that you should in your mind think that you might be asked to pay that back at some stage. Now, I just want to be clear about that. I don't, there's a lot of crystal balling around this concept of JobKeeper. First of all, we're asked as business owners to crystal ball whether we will to suffer a 30% downturn. Will that continue? Honestly, none of us know. The reality is that things could go much further south than they are at the moment. We just don't know. So we've made various in good faith projections and so forth. We will end up paying money to our staff based upon the fact that we are given JobKeeper or not. But if we're given JobKeeper, then we will pay it over. I can't promise this, but I think it's very unlikely in the circumstances described that someone who has acted in good faith, has passed on that money to their staff, will then be penalised in a way that they are asked to return that money and suffer the cash flow problems that might flow from that. That seems to be the very opposite of what JobKeeper is for. I suspect, we're not going to see a huge ATO workforce going around in trench coats, knocking on our door at the dark of night and dragging us outside because we applied for JobKeeper and ended up at 29%, not 30%. I just don't think that practically is going to happen. I can't promise it, but I just don't think it will practically happen. So what we don't want to be doing is being disincentivized by the scheme at this stage by saying, well, it's just too risky for that to happen. I think that if you've done things in good faith, as it sounds like has been done here, it's by Matthew, isn't it, I think?
Matthew, yes.
Then I would be amazed if you ended up being the one that was left holding the baby, so to speak, by having to return money that your employees had otherwise been paid in good faith. So if you were wanting to be ultra cautious, what I would be doing is calling the ATO, keeping a record of that call from your perspective, saying, I did call, I did ask, I was worried about this, I made this point, I explained that that I wouldn't be able to pay this back in due course, or it would significantly damage me, and keep a record of that call, just so that you've got it there should anyone turn up in a trench coat one dark night and ask for the money back. I don't know why they're wearing trench coats, by the way, but it just feels like that's what someone from the ATO would wear if they came and knocked on my door.
It's appropriate, isn't it?
Yeah.
Chantel says, hi Ed, thank you for all your assistance. We are looking at going back to the office. We still need to keep those employees that have been stood down under the Fair Work Act stood down. Would we need to change them from a Fair Work to a JobKeeper enabled stand down?
You should if there's no longer a stoppage of work. So they were only entitled to be stood down under those stoppage in work rules. Remember, there was something that has happened to your business that was outside your control that caused a stoppage in your work. There's quite a narrow definition in the Fair Work Act on that. So you'd be better off. It's to some degree a cosmetic thing, rather than you don't need to physically bring people back in to send them back out. It's just perhaps communicating to them to say you were originally stood down on this basis. We are subsequently reopening our business. However, we need to continue with the stand down, which we are proposing to do on this basis. Technically, you'll have to do the 3-day consultation period, but that's the way in which you'd do it, and you would consult with them and then confirm it in writing as well.
Okay. From Ben, we have an employee who is high risk and has been on annual leave for some time. Is there any update on high risk cases?
So you've got an employee who's high risk and currently off work. So this is a safety issue rather than a Fair Work Act or JobKeeper issue. So you've got an obligation to provide a safe workplace to your staff members. Now that's if a staff member has particular high risk characteristics. They might be pregnant, they might have let's say an immune deficiency or something like that. Then you need to consider their particular circumstances to ensure that you're not creating an environment that's problematic for them. Typically what would happen is that you might agree for them to go on leave, or agree unpaid leave with them, potentially even pandemic leave if they qualify for that. But at the moment that will carry on because the safety obligations just carry on indefinitely forever. There's no, that person will only be able to come back to work when you can provide them with a safe workplace.
This from Sue. She's a client, apropos of your touching on redundancies before. Do you have to have the redundancy meeting with both staff together or separately?
So the rule book is not as fixed or clear as that, but what I would propose is that you would do in the circumstance I used, where you have 2 people, you'd probably have the kick-off meeting or warning meeting, where you explain the business circumstances that have led to this situation that has means that a redundancy process is commencing, I'd probably do that in person. I'd still make sure it's together, all three of you, but I'd also have a fourth person there to witness and make sure that notes are taken. And then I would have individual consultation meetings with them after that, so that they have the time to air any concerns or questions without the other person there. Because one of their questions might well be, "Why on earth are you picking on me? That person's useless. I'm brilliant." So those sorts of things are going to be difficult to do unless you have individual meetings.
John says, touching on your story, Ed, what is a summary dismissal? Does that mean they were dismissed on the spot? We've had tough situations with employees in the past and would like to know our rights.
So that does mean that. It means that you're dismissed without notice, is another way of putting it. There's very limited ways in which you can dismiss an employee without notice. Typically, you can do that for reasons that are described sometimes as gross or serious misconduct. And those are really the worst of the worst situations, which include, in the case we went through, theft. Now, before you get to that, though, you can't just do it summarily, either by letter, text message, even a phone call. What you would need to do is go through a proper form of investigation into what happened, as we would have done with the assistance of the client here. And then there needs to be, and you might, in the course of that investigation, you might hold a meeting with the employee to discuss with them what you seem to have seen and what their response to that is. And then you might have a second meeting with them, which would be a potential termination meeting, but they'd still need the chance of that meeting to respond to the allegations in order that they are properly considered before you might then move forward to dismissal. So first of all, you only do summary dismissal where there's been such a fundamental breach of contract that the contract can't continue between you and the employee. But you need to get to the point where you go through a fair process before you would ever dismiss someone on that basis.
Okay. Another one to do with redundancy, this time from Marcello. Hi, Ed. At what rate does redundancy get paid out during A, JobKeeper enabled period, and B, full stand down period?
At what rate does redundancy pay is a statutory right that would get paid out at whatever the award or falling back on the National Employment Standards requires. In theory, if you're on a full stand down, then you're not earning wages at that point. Now, what would that mean, whether you have to pay nil redundancy? Let me check on that, because I do think this has been tested recently and I don't want to get it wrong. I'll come back on that one.
Okay. This from Craig. Apparently the restaurant award has had some temporary changes allowing permanent staff to have hours reduced down to 22.8 hours. What process do we need to observe to alter a full-time employee's hours and be compliant?
So first of all, check that that's the case with the award. I don't want you tripping over on that. Assuming that's the case, then you'd still need to go through the job, if you're a JobKeeper eligible business and the employee is a JobKeeper nominated employee, then you could do that as JobKeeper enabled direction. If not, you would need to consult and get agreement from the employee to reduce their hours.
From Rosemarie, I have a client with contractors they employ on 12-month contracts. That is, a new contract every 12 months. They are paid through their payroll and not invoiced through their own company to the employer. This has been going on for over 3 years. They were employed on March 1, but given it as a 12-month contract, in essence, they had not been employed for 12 months. However, on the other hand, they have been employed for 12 months because they have been rolling 12-month contracts. Could they be nominated for JobKeeper?
Well, it sounds, given the contract, they're probably, that you're not looking at the regular and systematic definition anyway. It sounds like they're probably permanent employees, given they've been doing this for 3 years on a fixed set of hours, and it doesn't sound like they're true contractors. They're being paid through payroll. So I'd suggest that they are probably eligible, but you'd need to check with them as to whether they've tried to seek eligibility as a contractor, sole trader, for themselves. They might have done that, and if they've done that for themselves, you wouldn't be able to do it for them as well.
And in line with our 45-minute mantra, can I finish with a comment?
Oh wow, that flew by.
It did fly.
Let's do a couple more questions, and just because that must mean that I was waffling on for ages.
Okay, let me find one.
What about the ones that came through the emails?
We've touched on that.
Yeah.
Oh,
Is that one there, Lee?
I'll highlight.
Carolyn?
Carolyn.
Yep.
Yeah.
From Carolyn.
Yep.
Hi, Ed. I've heard you say regarding JobKeeper that, quote, you are in until you are out, unquote. As a childcare operator, once the government relief package finishes at the end of June, and I've been thinking we won't meet the 30% downturn, so we will be out. However, my accountant is going with the in until you are out theme and forecasting my cash flow to include JobKeeper. Your thoughts would be very much appreciated on this.
That's my belief as to how it will work. You'll continue reporting and forecasting, which your accountant will probably be doing for you. But I think your accountant is right to presume at the moment that you will. But I'd make that presumption cautiously because there could be some clarification on that in due course. It is a bit fuzzy at the moment, but my understanding of the way the system works is that you're in until you're told you're out.
This one from La Luca Cucina in Brisbane. We have a small team who should all get JobKeeper. We started the year with a new accounting system and struggled to get onto the single touch payroll system, and was advised by our accountant that the ATO had some issues and were asking for businesses to suspend their applications temporarily. COVID has presented the issue of application by STP, and now my accountant has advised that they are able to manually input the data. As of today, I have not received JobKeeper and contacted the accountant who said that the ATO has now extended primary payments to the 31st of May. Is that correct?
I've not heard. I mean, you can apply until the 31st of May. So technically speaking, you won't get paid until 14 days after that. So in theory, you could be getting payments for April in June. So the way the rules work is it basically says 14 days into the month, so that would be yesterday, unless you haven't made the application fully until, let's say, the 5th of June, 5th of May, sorry, in which case it would be 14 days after that. So I think that's probably what your accountant means, is that it would be 14 days, up to 14 days after you made the application. There was a good one as well about sales reps going into hospitals, I think.
I think this is the one we're about to touch on now. Ian from Australasian Medical and Scientific, a client of Employ Shores. We have a number of salespeople who need to call on doctors in hospitals to promote our products. As COVID-19 restrictions are now being gradually loosened, they know they would have to follow hospital guidelines, and as an employer, we provide as safe a working environment as possible. What do we do if someone says, I don't want to return to field visits?
Good question. I would thought it'd be a good time to be doing this. From what I understand, hospitals are pretty quiet at the moment, so you'd probably have a good time to go and meet with your medical clients to discuss product with them. But I'm not being facetious in that either. I do genuinely think that's the case. So basically the question is a question that we need to address here, which is why I thought it was interesting that we have field staff, and what do you do if they don't want to go out to meetings? So the approach that we have taken, which is probably a level above what the law requires, is that we are saying to our field staff, first of all, are you happy going, on the presumption that we can provide you with a safe working environment and put necessary protections in place, are you happy going back into the field? So we've consulted with the staff basically to ask them for their opinions. And I think most, if not all, staff have said yes to that. But if there were, for example, if someone had special conditions that we weren't aware of, say, for example, someone was pregnant but we weren't aware of that yet, they could have had at that point a chance to mention that they don't want to do it. And we would have accepted that at face value. We wouldn't have even needed them to give us the reasoning. But that was our choice as to how we wanted to do it. You could be firmer than that, and you could say that we're following all government guidance, and in arranging these meetings. Not only that, we're going above and beyond. We're going to ask X, Y, and Z questions, which is what we're also doing. We have a list of questions that must be asked before any field meetings. and you may ask a similar set of questions. It'll probably need to be tailored a bit for you guys. So asking a hospital whether anyone has had COVID-19 in their workplace might get you a fairly straight answer. Maybe it won't. Maybe not all these practices or hospitals you're visiting have seen that. But you should ask a series of questions on, because I think that's a reasonable thing to do in the context of providing a safe workplace. And then the staff can go out. So choose whether you want to ask them whether they want to do it. If you don't want to be that, open that door, I suppose, then make sure you're explaining to them exactly what you're doing to provide a safe work environment. If they're still refusing, then I'd look at it on an individual case, and I'd invite them in first of all for a discussion, try and understand why it is they're refusing and solve it through communication. If you needed to escalate, you could end up going into a disciplinary process.
Okay. From Amanda, I have a long-term casual employee on JobKeeper. We're a club and have not opened back up yet and have not had work for employees to do. They have been paid JobKeeper payments. They have advised they are actively looking for other work and will not be returning to our employment. Do we pay JobKeeper until they find another position, or do we accept her seeking other employment as a resignation?
Hi, Amanda. I'd ask and clarify exactly what's going on there. You say that you're doing this. Is that to supplement your JobKeeper income? You say you're not coming back. Do I take that as your resignation? But what you don't want to do is take that at face value, and it's a communication that's been misconstrued. So I'd get that put in writing as well, asking via email. I'd have a conversation, and if they say yes, I'm definitely not coming back, so please can you confirm that, and that you're therefore giving me notice. And remember as well, if it did result in their resignation and you stop doing JobKeeper, they can still go and get Job Seeker.
Bernadette has fired through a whole bunch of questions, but I might just fire a couple of quick Q&As at you.
Sure.
See what you have come back with it. Bernadette says, I have an employee who is questioning my understanding of JobKeeper. Can you please correct my understanding if it is wrong? $1,500 is the gross amount.
That's right, but just to quickly, you know how I feel. I've got thousands of you guys questioning my understanding of JobKeeper every day. so you know how I feel, Bernadette. But yes, 1,500 is correct gross amount.
Okay, she
Per
states.
fortnight.
Yeah.
JobKeeper fortnight.
Yep, it is about 1,310 net per fortnight.
Depends on the tax position of the employee. Yeah.
It is not an added 1,310 on top of wages earned in the ordinary fortnight.
Agreed.
It is a benefit to the employer to subsidise the employee's wages so that we can afford to continue employing them.
Yes, if they are working for you at that time, that's when JobKeeper works best for you. But if they are stood down or not working at the moment, then really all it is you being a clearinghouse for a social security that you're passing on to them.
If the employee earns less than 1,310 net in the fortnight, the employer makes up the difference as they have the money from the JobKeeper.
Yes.
If the employee earns more than 1,310, the JobKeeper pays 1,310 of the amount and the employer pays the difference, which is their pay.
Yes.
The remainder of the $1,500 received is paid by the employer as tax.
The remainder of the $1,500. Yes, sorry, yeah, the gap between whatever the net and gross position is paid, PAYG.
The employer pays the superannuation of the amount of agreed ongoing hours for the employee.
Yes, for hours worked, but if there was, let's say the employee was meant to do 10 hours a week in their original circumstances, but you don't have that work and you've directed them therefore to stand down, you're still giving them $1,500 to sit at home. That those aren't wages earned, even though their underlying contract is for 10 hours. Therefore, you wouldn't pay super on the $1,500. It's only if they actually do the 10 hours.
Gotcha. And so this is somewhat related there. If employee earns more due to JobKeeper than their ordinary hours, superannuation is not paid on that amount unless the employer chooses to.
Spot on.
Employers can come.
That's good at this.
Hmm?
She's good at this.
She's
going to get her in to do this for me. Take a day off.
Final one. Employers can come to an agreement about the amount of hours the employee will work, but must pay the agreed/award wage to the employee. their hourly rate of pay cannot be reduced.
Agreed. Spot on.
That was a good one to finish on.
Yeah.
Can I finish on a comment now?
Yeah, sure.
This is from from Ian, from the Beechworth Pantry in, I'm assuming, Victoria. Yes. Hi Ed, my partner Robin has listened to you every day. She calls you her new best friend. Thanks so much for keeping her stress levels to a manageable level. Our JobKeeper came through on Tuesday and she says she is now getting a good night's sleep. Drop into the Beechworth Pantry sometime and have a delicious piece of her famous passion fruit sponge in an unashamed plug for their business.
Very unashamed. I will very unashamedly take you up on that and come and enjoy some passion fruit sponge. That sounds lovely. Maybe a cup of tea as well. So, yeah, thank you very much for tuning in. I appreciate that. Nice to have a new mate. Good. Thanks, guys. Have a good weekend. See you on Monday.